The spiritual path to enlightenment on today's Oblyron spirituality. Greetings everyone, I am Oblyron, Lord of the Underworld and consort to the most lovely Hecate. Thank you for joining me on today's episode where we are going to talk about the spiritual stages of awakening and how they can lead to enlightenment. Now we're going to deal specifically with the initial awakening in the activation of the chakras and Kundalini, and then we're going to move on to the stages, the main stages of the alchemical process. Now for many of us, the stages of awakening start with the activation of our chakras in the Kundalini process. In my personal reference, that was called the quickening of light, which I covered in 7 chakras, 7 sins, and 7 planes of existence. And I find that most of the spiritual teachings that we see online have to revolve mostly around that. It has to deal with the awakening process in, the meditative stages. It has to deal with imagining the figures of light, and that's where a lot of our sayings of love and light come from. What I've noticed is that is pretty much the beginning phase. Just because we have had an awakening in that sense, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are going onto the path of enlightenment. And when I was going through that phase for myself, excuse me, I noticed that I was actually in a very big danger of going into a spiritual psychosis. I actually went into that for a while. And I notice a lot of people who do go through that process go through the same thing as well. We cling to the light. We cling to, the powers of manifestation because it is comforting to us. And I get it. I mean, like I said, I was there at one point too. We have a tendency to stay with what is comfortable for us. We have a tendency to want to, gravitate towards pleasure and stay away from anything which causes displeasure. And so, the chakra activation is a very important part of the whole process. It is a part which allows us to step out of our bodies. It's the part that allows us to see that, the universe is greater than our own egos. It's greater than ourselves. But just because we have a spiritual experience, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are on the path to enlightenment. From my perspective, I see a lot of things of the modern spiritual movement, which is that there's a lot of self-righteous elements to it as well. Especially, I would say, maybe around pre-2020 to a little bit afterwards. There seemed to be a lot of holier than thou type of attitudes. It seems to be changing now, especially within the past year or two. I think a lot of people are kind of coming off of that spiritual high that they've experienced with their chakra activations, and they're finding that there's more to our spiritual experience than just that. And what I found is that once we start to move beyond that, the next stage really involves the alchemical process. The 3 main processes, anyways, but whatever the word is, it has to do with the Negredo, the Albedo, and the Rubedo. Now there is a citronitas in between the Albedo and the Rubedo, and there are also several other minor stages in between that. But I'm just going to cover the 3 main ones. So the Negredo is when the love and light era starts to come to an end. It's when we start to descend into the shadow, and it's just as the name implies, it's the blackening. It's when we cannot we can't ignore our shadows anymore. And for me, that process started around the time when I hit 40. And that actually coincides a lot with what Carl Jung has to say about the shadow, and also about integrating the shadow, is that there's just something that happens when we enter into our 40s. Now, it doesn't mean that, you know, life before that is easy, or that we haven't been through hard times, because, you know, we all go through hard times. We have all experienced setbacks in our 20s, 30s, and, you know, even teen years and whatnot. But at around that time, when you hit 40, there's just something different about the experience. And Carl Jung observed this in many of his cases as well. So, yeah, I mean, when my Negredo hit, it was pretty much a complete shattering of the ego. This is very common. You know, everything that you thought you were, everything that you ever strived for, everything that you called your ego or yourself, whatever it is, it just gets shattered. It just gets destroyed. And again, like I said, you know, we can have setbacks before 40. We can acquire a lot of wisdom before 40. But there's just something different about that Negredo experience post 40. For me, you know, I was basically brought to my knees. I just wanted to end it all. And at no other point in my life had I ever gotten to that type of, you know, destitution. So yeah, it was quite a challenging time. And that's what's supposed to happen. A lot of times in the alchemical process, a lot of people will either stop seeking, or they'll turn around. You know, they'll go back to safer waters. So they start to go back to, you know, the same sort of meditations. They start to go back to the crystals and all that kind of stuff, because the Negredo experience is just too overpowering. You know, once you go down the alchemical process, it's not, you're not guaranteed to complete it. That's the thing. You know, when you start to, let's say, open your chakras, you know, we've all experienced that. We've all experienced that ecstasy and that elation. But the Negredo, not everyone completes it. Sometimes people turn away. Sometimes people go back to what is more normal for them. So yeah, you know, that's pretty much the Negredo in a nutshell. There's a lot of other videos that cover it in depth. This video is pretty much just to serve as an overall explanation of things and what to watch out for. So as we progress through the alchemical process, when we go from the Negredo to the Albedo, that is pretty much when things start to quiet down. The Negredo experience is very noisy. It's very chaotic. It's very traumatic. And so, you know, I mean, you're basically having your sense of self be deconstructed. And it's like slowly peeling away the layers of your psyche. It's not a comfortable experience. It's a very intense experience. I cover this twice in my previous videos, in I was possessed by Satan, and also I left my wife for a goddess. Those I talk more about my Negredo experience in detail. So yeah, if you're interested in that, go ahead and check that out. But yeah, as we go to the Albedo, you know, that sort of noise begins to die out a little bit. It's almost like, well, I think you know, it's reference to, like, let's say a full moon at night. You know, you're in the darkness, you're in the black, you're in your own isolation and solitude, but you know, there's a moon up above you, and it's sort of a very quiet, serene experience. And yeah, I would say that is pretty accurate too. Pretty much, this is when This is when your anima or your animus starts to make themselves known, and this is when a lot of the other archetypes within your shadow psyche start to make themselves known. It's basically discovering your shadow, all the shadow aspects that you've repressed, all the shadow aspects that you have ignored through your life. You're basically facing them all head on, and you realize that it's not necessarily an evil side of you. It's just it could be some of the more uncomfortable sides of you, but it's not necessarily evil. And when we could recognize that and truly integrate it, that's when we begin to really start to flourish again. Now, for me, and I also said this in Temptation and Spiritual Power, this was when Hecate made herself known in my life. This is when I also descended to the underworld. For me, that was a metaphor of descending into my own psyche and into my own shadow. And it was really recognizing all of those aspects in myself. And so Jung had warned that this particular phase could lead to a false sense of enlightenment. And yeah, he was absolutely right. When I experienced my Albedo, because it was coming out of such a traumatic and chaotic time, the Negredo phase, it had this sort of calming effect. Even though I was facing my shadow, even though I was facing all the things that I didn't want to see, it still was not going through what I went through at my darkest hours. It was very soothing, it was very calming, and yes, it can feel like enlightenment. However, that's not the end phase. This is the moment when we begin to discover our calm and our peace again too. And a lot of people, when they discover their calm and their peace again, they get so addicted to their calm and peace that they don't want to disrupt that. And that was one of the reasons why Jung had warned against that. A lot of people who kind of enter or who have been in their albedo phase, it can actually last for years. And during that time, we can also have a tendency to become enamored with our own inner psyche, because a lot of internal archetypes start to make themselves known. We realize we begin to realize all these things about ourselves that we have never seen before, and so we start to analyze our actions and look at our actions from different perspectives. Well, you can spend a very long time just looking at yourself and looking at your psyche and analyzing every single little detail. But that is not the true enlightenment. The true enlightenment is when we start to not become so enamored with the archetypes within us, but we start to put a lot of that into action as we go into the Rubedo phase. Now, there is a Citronitis before that. I'm not going to cover that. I'm just going to gloss over it and go straight into the Rubedo. Many practices actually take out the Citronitis, just to keep it in line numerologically with threes. It has a tendency to fit in with other practices a lot easier with that as well. So yeah, once we're able to fully integrate our archetypes, and also before I get to the Rubedo phase, one of the biggest things is to also be able to understand pretty much that our psyche are based off of, it is based off of universal concepts which we all share. So, you know, inside of every one of us, there is the sage, there is the warrior, there is the temptress, all this kind of stuff. Another way which you can look at it is like, let's say we take the main planets of astrology. We don't have to necessarily know our astrological placements, but if we look at the planets as archetypes, like Mars and Venus, you know, the sun and moon, we can also be able to integrate those aspects within ourself. So the Albedo phase is about integrating the archetypes into the psyche, not just the anima or the animus, but also, again, every one of the other human archetypes which we all experience. And that also leads to an interesting question is, you know, if we're just a series of archetypes and we have a tendency to express certain archetypes at a time, at any given time, well, then who are we really? You know, are we really anything? That's a very interesting question. You know, when I say, okay, I am Lord of the Underworld and consort to the most lovely Hecate, it's just essentially saying that, you know, I have recognized my shadow within me as an archetype, my divine masculine, I guess you could say, as well as also recognizing the divine feminine within me in the goddess. And so it's just an integration of masculine and feminine, of the shadow within me. And like I said, you know, there's also the planetary archetypes. There's all kinds of archetypes in which they're based off of one another. It's like having let's say colors on a palette, and then we, you know, each archetype is a color on a palette, and then we paint the picture of our lives with these different colors. And we are not those individual colors, but we have a tendency to express those colors to be able to paint whatever picture that we want. That's really what integrating our archetypes are. And when we have the ability to do that, that's when we start to enter into the Rubedo phase, and that is, you know, the phase of action. That is the phase of true enlightenment. It is the phase when we realize when we've integrated those archetypes and we have the ability to truly be the artist of our life. We know how to act, we know, well, and also we know when certain archetypes come up. Sometimes we may manifest more of the temptress within us. Sometimes we may manifest the warrior within us, or we may have to manifest the wise sage. But the real goal is to not get stuck in any one of them. You know, how many people do we know where they kind of get stuck in, let's say, the wise sage archetype, and they never come out of that? You know, they're just always that person. Well, Jung would say that that isn't necessarily true enlightenment either. It's when we can shed all of those things. Again, we oscillate between these different types of archetypes. We have a tendency to be what we need to be when we need to be it. And so when we can get to that type of understanding of our own psyche, well, then that's when we have truly come into our own. It's when we step out of our ego and we realize a sense of self, but that sense of self is based off of the archetypes of others. It's based off of these universal energies. And it sounds scary, but if you think about it, you know, let's look at what we're made out of. You know, we're made out of atoms and subatomic particles and all these things. So when we look at ourselves on that type of a level, is anything what we're made of truly and individually us? And the answer is no, because the same neutrons or protons and electrons that exist within me also exist within you, but then they also exist in the world around us. So if we were, so if basically none of that is uniquely or individually us, then why would our personality be uniquely or individually us as well? You know, we would be an amalgam of all these different patterns and programs which have a tendency to kind of come together and coalesce in our bodies as the archetype. And so that's when we really begin to lose our sense of ego, and we really begin to regain the sense of self, is when we begin to understand that and not only understand it, but truly feel it throughout out of every cell of our body. And if you notice, you know, nothing of what I'm talking about is about, you know, extending out into the galaxy or chasing fanciful tales of, you know, extraterrestrials or even gods and goddesses or any of that. It all just has to deal with the internal world. It has to deal with the internal psyche. And yeah, it really kind of does a number on you, because it's like, you know, in so many of our spiritual practices, especially at the beginning, when we activate our chakras, you know, you feel like you just want to go into the cosmos or something. It's just this wonderful experience. But, you know, after X amount of years of doing that and then diving into the alchemical process, it really just kind of brings it full circle back to the self and back to the present moment. You realize you don't have to be anywhere. You don't have to be anyone. You don't have to do anything. You just are. And then life becomes a living meditation. You know, when you walk, when you talk, when you interact with others, it becomes a living meditation. And that's why, you know, going into the Rubedo phase, it's like becoming the Bodhisattva. You know, you go from a hermit mode in the Albedo to an active mode in the Rubedo. You're not afraid to go back into civilization. You're not afraid to talk to people. You're not afraid to experience new things. You know, you're not above it all. You just are what you need to be when you need to be it. And yeah, it's a lot more freeing than it seems. It's a lot more freeing to lose yourself and dissolve into your surroundings than it is to always hang on to your ego and to always hang on to who you think you are. So, quick recap. You know, we have the illumination of our chakras with our Kundalini awakening. That's the beginning phases. And then we begin to go into the alchemical process with the Negredo. The blackening, we pretty much get destroyed there. And then we enter into the recognition of our shadow in the Albedo. And we spring back into action with the Rubedo. And as Carl Jung and the alchemists would say, you know, that's where we truly achieve enlightenment. That's where we go and we discover the philosopher's stone when we start to spring back into action with full integration of our light and shadow, masculine, feminine, and all the archetypes at our disposal. So, if you've resonated with today's video, make sure to like and subscribe, or perhaps leave a comment and let us all know how you've resonated with it. Also, if you're interested, then check out my Discord server. I do weekly meditations on Saturday, weekly guided meditations. And again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining me today on this video. I appreciate each and every one of you, and having you here is quite wonderful. So, love and light, and wisdom in shadow, And now we shall close with the chant of Oblyron. Amde sote, amde Oblyron, amde sote, amde Oblyron.